everyone at this book club event of IMD. My name is Peter Vanham. I'm editorial director leadership at Fortune and a big fan of IMD. And with me today are two great IMD faculty and the editors of a new book called The Sustainable Business Transformation, Julia Binder and Knut Haanaes. Officially, welcome to you.
Thank you so much.
Well, let's get straight into it. This new book has come out. Julia, by the way, your second book in 3 months, I've learned, which is got to be a new record. And it is called The Sustainable Business Transformation. Now, we're going to talk about what that is, what that means in practice, because you've got a lot of case studies in this book. But I want to start, of course, with some events from recent developments in the news. In 5 days, we'll be witnessing the inauguration of Donald J. Trump as President of the United States. It is somebody who, however you define sustainable business transformation, I think would not subscribe to that notion that we need sustainable business transformation. So what does that mean for any company that is interested in making a sustainable business transformation? Julia, I'll ask the question first to you, and then Knut, I'd love for you to weigh in as well.
Sure, I think on the surface, and I think if every one of us is looking at the situation, we know it's not good news. For everyone in sustainability, it's not that we were full of excitement when we heard about the election results, quite the opposite. And I think it took us all a while to collectively, A, make sense, and B, get over what was happening there. And now we see that Trump will be in office very soon. To be honest, I think my reflections over time, now that I had some time to let it sit with me, it will remain not good news. We see already what is happening. We see that with BlackRock, now the last one, leaving the Net Zero Asset Management Alliance. We see the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Many of the big banks have left them. We see that many of the big corporates are actually rolling back, whether it's on DEI, whether it's on net zero goals. So I think the news are full of these kind of developments. Now, if I were to make sense of this, I don't think that businesses will roll back on all of these dimensions. They will signal that they want to align with Trump. They don't want to lose the support here, which I think makes a lot of sense. But sustainable business transformation is not all about what I signal and what I say. We know that from our research, for instance, that even if you have good intentions and all these nice pledges, we oftentimes don't meet them. And now we have the opposite, right? Sometimes we roll back now more visibly, more verbally, but I think many of the initiatives actually will continue. Companies and investors have put a lot of money into sustainable business transformations, and these developments will not simply stop from one day to the other. Paul Polman has actually put that very nicely. He said, the green train has left the station. So even if we now see a lot of this, let's say verbally rollback, I don't think that all of this will be happen in practice. And maybe another thing that at least could give us hope is that, for instance, California is very much advanced in their regulation when it comes to sustainability. If you as a business want to make business with California, which let's say many of the US business want, you will still need to meet that threshold. If you want to make business with European business, you still want to meet that threshold. So a lot of this is rhetoric. This rhetoric is not positive. It's quite the opposite. It's not good for the sustainable community as a whole. But I would also not be just caught by that rhetoric. And before I push it over to Knut, and I think he can totally elaborate on that as well, is maybe we should not be too US-centric either. We should acknowledge what is happening, but recently I'm looking actually more to China, where a lot is happening in terms of what they believe are future markets, and all of these future markets are actually in the sustainability space, and they are really going very forcefully behind that. So maybe it starts for us also when you're based in Europe to also rethink whom is it that we're comparing ourselves to? And when we look at some of the big market opportunities, China is actually much more advancing in that direction than the US is at the moment.
Very interesting reflections. I want to hand it over to you, but I do want to jump in right away with what I think is also a crucial question when it comes to your book, which is, what do we actually mean by sustainable business transformation? We've now heard, as Julia said, sort of the rhetoric might shift back and forth with certain buzzwords that are in favor or not. But let's focus on the content. What does it actually mean for you, sustainable business transformation, and then put it into the context of what's happening today?
Okay, so that's a double question that I'll tee us off with, Peter. let me start with just a short observation, and then I'll go into your specific questions. Just before Christmas, we all IMD faculty we were asked to say something about the trends around sustainability, and I almost regretted it, but I still stand for it. Mine I called ESG is dead, long live sustainability. I don't mean that ESG is fully dead, but there's something around the movement around ESG which actually has gotten a real pushback and will continue to get a real pushback. I think we'll have to continue focusing on the environmental side, but there's a big question mark around how and how much businesses will focus on the S of ESG. So that's a first thing.
I know we're a very academic and educated audience here, but just for the very, very few people who are dialing in and who might still wonder what does ESG stand for, just quickly tell us environmental, social, and governance. Is that how you understand ESG?
That's what it is, and and Julia is the expert at this, so I don't want to kind of steal her thunder. But the ESG originally is a completely non-political thing. It's actually a development needed for investors to be able to compare their performance to others and to compare their performance to last year and predict next year. So it's a way for us to understand the non-financial performance of firms. But it's been hijacked in so many different ways, maybe especially on the S side where it's been linked to woke, etc. So I think for now, there will be a continued focus on sustainability, on the environmental side, etc. And maybe it's time for a little bit of a sharpening of the S side of ESG. So that's one thing. A second thing, I feel strongly about this, what's happening now will, of course, shift the world order as it relates to sustainability. And maybe in some ways, a little bit of a shift is timely. One thing I'm thinking about is the COP negotiations happening every year. Last time we had 100,000 participants, etc. Maybe they need to be focused and sharpened, because I think it's maybe naive for us to think we can solve hundreds of problems at the same time. I think the biggest environmental successes we've had are focused, whether it's acid rain, CFCs, the ozone layer, whether it's unleaded gasoline, etc. So maybe a little bit of a shift in terms of the, let's call it the global order on sustainability is not just a negative. Not saying it's positive, but change has some attributes to it as well. And then your question, what is sustainability transformation? And let me take a stab at it, Peter. I think it has.
You wrote a whole book about it, Knut. So
yeah,
I'm
exactly.
Sure so right to the heart of it, man.
So I think sustainability transformation, we can think about it on a societal level, and we can think about it on a company level, right? The firm level. If we think about it first on the societal level, I think of it this way, that we're in a century, we're going to change. We're going to have an energy transition. We're going to have a circularity transition. And we're going to have a transition in terms of the responsibility of companies. That is a real sustainability transformation on the societal level. And it takes time, naturally. It's easy to see it, and it takes a long time to do it. And we're in that process. In terms of companies, I think for companies, it's a question of recognizing that this is important. And it's easy to recognize it if we take a long-term perspective. But it just feels like it's not necessary if we take a very short-term perspective. But sustainability transformation for a company is actually being able to build it into the decisions, the priorities, the way they work, etc., and saying,
right,
the changes pose opportunities. We have to address them. They're business decisions. And I think, last thing I'll say, I think we're in the phase for companies where they need to think about how do we make money on sustainability.
Yeah. So that addresses the part of the question that says business transformation, the fact that companies change their business models in order to reflect a new reality where sustainability is more important. Now, the part that I do want to double click on, and maybe I'll get back to you, Julia, is sustainability, because, we have so many discussions about these terms, sustainability, ESG, and related terms. And yet often we don't truly know what we're really talking about. So from your point of view, in having edited this book and written a previous book 3 months ago about sustainability, what is the most simple definition that you use or would use for sustainability?
Yeah, and then maybe just to quickly go back to what Knut already defined on ESG. I think ESG, and this is very important, is really about this risk management framework. This is seeing the outside in. So basically, how do environmental, social, and governance factors pose a potential financial risk for the value of a firm? So, and obviously, I as an investor or I as a CEO care about these numbers, right? So we see the LA fires, right? So this is something now as an insurance company, obviously, this is a massive ESG risk. So I need to be aware about this. It's a risk management investment framework. Sustainability is different. Sustainability is an inside-out perspective, and it's the question, how do I as a company, with my products, with my operations, with my processes, how do I potentially have an impact, and this could be positive or negative, on planet or society? I think in many ways we have been very much in this mindset of how can we reduce the harm we put on people and planet. And now there are proponents out there, among them you yourself, Peter, with Andre Hoffman, among them Paul Polman with Andrew Winston, that basically say, should we talk about doing less harm as business, or should we actually talk about how can we positively contribute to society and planet? And I think alongside the spectrum, we have this definition of sustainability, which is at the lower end, at the least we should do is doing less harm. How can we reduce the negative impact we have? That is maybe, let's say, the least we need to do in terms of sustainability. And then the more we go then on the other side of the spectrum, we're talking maybe about regeneration. How can I actually contribute positively to nature and society? And I think this is where we are focusing much more.
Thank you. I really find that very useful to frame it as such, that ESG is about outside in.
Yep.
How does the world affect my company?
Yep.
And that sustainability is about inside out. How do I affect the world around me? And by the way, everyone, thanks for joining in. We're already in the middle of our discussion. I just want to give you a note. We'll be continuing this discussion about sustainable business transformation for the next 30 minutes or so. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, I've got many questions prepared, but if you get any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. If you're following us on LinkedIn, then I'm going to hope and pray that somebody in the Zoom, because we live in the Zoom world here. You see, we're being zoomed out to LinkedIn, but I hope that somebody will also have the outside in perspective and send us the question from LinkedIn. So continuing then, we know what it is, sustainability, we know what it is, sustainable business transformation. I think the contribution of this book, Knut, isn't it that this is a practical playbook, that it shows how companies have gone on the sustainability business transformation and that we can learn from their examples. Could you give us a few actionable insights and perhaps a few companies that you've studied in the book and talk to us about that?
Sure. Yes. So first of all, I think what's important about the book, from my perspective, is this is not Julia and myself who have sat down and written a book on sustainability. We are merely editors. This is a contribution by a large number of IMD's faculty where they share their thoughts on this sustainability transformation. And they, of course, come from different perspectives. They come from strategy, the digital side, of course, the leadership side, the accounting side, marketing, etc. So that's the value of the book from my perspective. And then following on that, this is IMD, and we are not just about strategies. We are very much about leadership, people, engaging organizations, etc. And Julia, James Henderson, and myself, we built this program 3-4 years ago. It's called LSBT, so Leading Sustainable Business Transformation. And when we built it, we said it's about the head, that's strategy. It's about the heart, that's leadership. It's about the hands, that's getting things done. And from my perspective, that's the value of the book. It's not just about thinking it. It's not just about leading the organization. It's actually about getting to the actions as well. And
that makes a lot of sense,
and this is what we mobilized around, and what I love, I read the book and I feel the chapters of colleagues are so interesting, and part of it is the examples, right? And there are lots of them. So I can mention one or two, but I
Please.
think it's unfair to almost to pull out single companies because there are many, right? There are
I
lots
know,
of
but you know, Knut,
lots
I
of
will
companies.
give you the I'll
Yeah,
absolve you for that.
yeah,
I'm a journalist
absolutely.
and I like to get practical, and I know that in the world of economics we have to be complete.
Yeah,
So
no,
blame it on me. Blame it on me.
yeah. So I'll take one example. I'll start it off, and then Julia, maybe you want to continue as well. But one company that I like to kind of discuss, and I think it's well kind of profiled in the book as well, is the Finnish power system company Wärtsilä. So they produce power systems. Being in the region, I've known them forever because they produce the the big engines of ships, right? But they not only ships, but they're power systems. So in that business, they could have just said, okay, we keep doing things, and when the world changes, we'll change with it. But instead of that, the CEO around 2020 said, let's make decarbonization an opportunity. It will happen. Let's push it. Let's be proactive. Let's build things, and then the world will come to us, which has proven true as well. How can we build decarbonization as products? How can we build it as services as a company? How can we build not only what we do, but how build the ecosystem of collaborations, partnership, etc., so we can offer something holistic? And I think, how can we build research around it as well, to be one step ahead instead of just following the things when they happen? And for me, that's a little bit of a beautiful sustainability story, because it's about seeing the opportunity, it's about making the change, it's about not trying to do everything by yourself, and it's about technology and R&D. And I think all of those are really the key, let's say, elements that we have to think about if we want to make sustainability into an opportunity. So
Yeah.
that for me, it's like a great example.
It's a great example, and I now understand why you're hesitant to give examples, because it seems like you sort of oscillate towards Nordic companies, which I understand. That's fine. We're all from somewhere. Appreciate that. Julia, I want to ask you. So we've heard this example of Knut talking about one specific company that sort of said, we're going to see this as an opportunity, that has been successful with that apparently. If you take one step back and sort of look at the kinds of industries where that's actually possible, where you can say, well, we're going to adopt this new vision on what our company is, we're going to see this as an opportunity, we will build it and they will come. What kind of industries, where is that possible? Because I know there's some industries where they have to be behind the curve, or sort of followers, cannot be leaders because people don't want to pay for that, or not ready for that. So which industries are ready for that?
Look, we have some industries that are naturally more advanced, either because the pressure was already on them, or because it very much aligns. And I think Knut was mentioning Wärtsilä, which is in both energy and marine sector. And I think energy industry is a very good example. We've briefly touched in our pre-discussion on the energy transition, which is key to everything when we talk about sustainability transformation. We still need to balance the energy transition with the security of supply. But it's one of those where, if you look at who are the best ranked corporations for sustainable business transformation, the corporate knight ranking, for instance, you will see energy companies ranking quite high. You see Siemens, Schneider Electric, all of them, they see that it actually, there is a massive business case as well. When we basically now shift and if we transform, we can easily align this. And then there might be industries where it's more challenging. From my perspective, though, I think, so basically every industry where you have a lot of resources, it might pose a much bigger challenge. Every industry where you have a lot of, let's say, consumer resistance, let's say fashion. People are at the moment leaning much more to fast fashion, and not just fast, but now ultra fast fashion. If we look at Shein, for instance, there it's much more.
I didn't know that it was pronounced Shein.
Yeah.
I've learned something new, Julia.
Yeah, so it's really called ultra fast fashion. Now, we thought that H&M and Zara was actually a fast fashion, and now Shein has taught us that we can actually have a new kind of clothing every single day, right? So this is ultra fast fashion, and for these industries, it poses let's say it's much more challenging to bring in this slow kind of dimension, because here we really talk about changing consumer behavior versus energy, marine, wherever you have productivity gains, wherever you have efficiency gains, it's easier to align the two. And then I think maybe to your point at the beginning, Peter, then I don't go to a Trump administration and say I do that for the sake of the environment, but I go to a Trump administration and say I do that because it saves me cost. It's an efficiency gain. And then it's exactly the same thing I do. And the impact is the same, but the framing is a different one. And I think just to also double down on something that Knut has said before, because I think it's so important, maybe the current, let's say, backlash that we're experiencing, the winds that are going against us at the moment, are also, let's say, a wake-up call for sustainability to mature. We need to much better integrate it into strategy. What we should not have going forward is, here's our corporate strategy, and then we have a sustainability strategy, but they're only loosely aligned and linked. We actually, at the end goal should be our corporate strategy is our sustainability strategy, because it's so well integrated and because we have a strategic rationale for the things that we're doing. And I think we're going there, and many of the businesses that we portray in the book as best cases have actually really understood the strategic rationale, and that you can actually really either increase the resilience of the business, increase resource efficiency, de-risk some of your supply chains, right? So that there is a real, let's say, strategic rationale and business case behind going that direction, and not just, let's say, a moral responsibility, which is nice to have. But then, to your point, Peter, as soon as we have some changes in the political landscape, as soon as we have a new CEO, this may change. So I think for this to be much more stable and sustainable as well, we need to much better integrate into the day-to-day realities of the firm.
Right, that makes sense. So, I mean, I don't know if you have a Chief Sustainability Officer's program at IMD, but what I'm hearing you say is that's not going to no longer run in the future. It's going to be only Chief Strategy Officer programs from now on. I don't know if I'm going to get an angry email from your bosses at IMD after saying that. But let's talk a little bit about that leadership, though, because you pointed out already there's sort of forces pulling companies in different directions.
Yeah.
To what extent is leadership, the visionary leadership, or the strategic leadership, or the moral leadership, any of those three, is that actually a relevant factor in sustainable business transformation, or to what extent is it really all about the economics of things? I don't know if Julia or Knut, you want to take a stab at that.
I'm happy to go. So I think we rightfully talk a lot about walking the talk, right? So what is it that companies are actually getting done? The actions, the specific practices, the changes they implement. I often say I think talking the walk is equally important. And I'm not talking about greenwashing, right? Which is an easy way to think about this. I'm not thinking in this term, but when we think about a term that I think Knut will love to elaborate upon is systems leadership, the era that we're in demands that we're not just changing some product lines, some products, some incremental changes here and there. We actually need to reinvent entirely new systems, whether this is housing, mobility, food. The challenges that we're facing are so massive that no single company, no single leader will change that, him or herself. So leadership becomes incredibly important, not just in leading the firm, but also leading beyond the firm. It's about how do I engage stakeholders? How do I collaborate even with my competitors sometimes? How do I collaborate across the supply chain? How do I collaborate maybe with nonprofits and so on? So I think leadership and how I actually now execute on this agenda, how do I get mobilize stakeholders, engage them? How do I build trust? Which is actually for some companies, you asked Peter, what is sustainable business transformation? It will look very differently depending on your starting point, right? Some companies are already in a position where the transformation might not be that difficult. But then we have, let's say, oil and gas, tobacco, some of the, let's say, dark side players where it's much more difficult to transform. And here leadership is so key because you have so much pushback. And you're basically, you're reinventing the identity of the firm. And then leadership is absolutely central to all of this.
Are there any examples where the challenge is hard, right? Because, Knut, you talked about power systems, it worked out because, apparently the sector was ready for that. But are there any examples of those hard sectors where it takes real leadership that you've seen in the book that actually has already been successful?
Yeah. So let me start, and then please just follow on, Julia. I want to start by just building on the leadership in general, and then we'll go into the sectors, okay? Because the one thing I want to add to what Julia said is we all know sustainability. If we go back 30, 40 years, everything was about this is a future challenge. Now we all know it's a current challenge, which means sustainability is about, of course, preventing and thinking about the long term, etc. But it's also about adapting here and now, reacting to crisis, being able to respond when something happens, etc. That's a different kind of leadership. We haven't really been systematic about that in the past, but I think that's what we're in the middle of. We're in the middle of this long term, doing the right things, trying to prevent, short term, being ready for the things that we haven't necessarily planned for, and even planning for the things that can happen. So to me, that's a big leadership thing. And then let's talk about sectors. Every sector has its challenge, right? Every industry, every sector has a challenge. So right now, one sector we're, of course, all focusing on because of the tragic fires in California is insurance. Insurance has seen this coming. And of course, they see this sector by sector. We will have consequences. There's a very big difference if we, almost any industry or area, if we insure things based on past data versus future data, because the future is different from the past, and that is largely a consequence of climate change, frankly, right? So that's one example, and then another example where we maybe can be specific about leadership is the oil industry. Let's just call it the oil industry, oil and the gas, oil industry. So the oil industry leadership there, my opinion, is complicated because on the one hand, the world needs energy. On the other hand, the world needs to address CO2. We have to do both. We can't just address CO2 without addressing the needs and the future needs for energy. So how do oil companies ensure energy, but gradually transform as we have to with the energy transition? That is, in my opinion, the quintessential leadership challenge. Addressing things that we need today, but also addressing the changes that need to happen and at speed. And that's what I think is the most interesting leadership challenge of all, you know?
I mean, it's super interesting. I mean, like, yeah, but you're asking the question, but I'm expecting you to answer it. So, you know, let's make it concrete. You know, like imagine that tomorrow, you know, you get called back to your home country and you're in charge of Statoil. What is the answer in that case for such a company?
So make me the Minister of Energy then, okay?
Sure.
In Norway, small country, but important sector in a small country. So I think, I mean, on the one hand, I have to make sure that I improve the sustainability of current, let's say, oil and gas. I have to focus on making it cleaner,
flaring,
in the right way, etc.
Yep.
All of that, that's easy. And then I have to make sure that we incentivize and we invest into the future. Renewables, new sources of energy, it could be nuclear as well. I don't think I can do that just as Norway. That's something I have to do international scale. We have to be players in the bigger system. And the trap we can fall into is staying as we are, which won't work, or only investing in the future, which actually makes us not improve the things we're doing today. That's, again, politically, let's call it not politics, but policy. That's a huge policy challenge. But for companies, if you go one level down, it's also a huge strategic challenge. Leadership, it's almost like this. Leadership is about accelerating what will have to happen anyway.
I got to say, I find this fascinating. Let's continue on this specific example. And Knut, I want to make sure you're still allowed back into Norway after this session. So I'll ask the same question.
Don't worry.
To Julia now, who's in no danger of losing Norwegian citizenship, I think. So Julia, let's take the example here. You know, you've heard from your energy minister, Knut Haanaes, energy minister of Norway. You are now the CEO of Statoil. What are you going to do differently?
Peter, Equinor. It used to be Statoil, now it's Equinor.
Oh, I
see.
see.
Just so we're.
You see, I live in the past. I live in the past, but I understand why they rebranded. I would call it greenwashing.
Same.
Probably, but but Julia, so you're the CEO of Equinor. What do you do? Because Knut has given us the example of what you do on a systemic level, right?
Yeah.
Like you got to balance, past and future. You got to look at the current and future. But your company, 90% of your assets are in oil and gas. So
Yep.
what are you going to do?
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. And I think in many ways, the interesting thing is innovation plays a key role, and yet we often don't touch it enough, particularly in that sector, because innovation is costly, it's risky, and what we currently have as a business model works fundamentally well if we only look at the economic dimension, right? So I think one of the, and Knut mentioned it is a systemic issue. As long as I can get oil and gas and all of this cheaply somewhere else, no way going alone, even with one company, going forcefully in that direction will be difficult. We have, because you asked for examples, a very good example in the book, which is about Neste, which used to be Neste Oil. And then a couple of years ago, they cut the oil out of their name and they said, as of now, Neste is all about renewable fuels. We have a patent. We have here a leading technology where we believe we can really, really have a competitive advantage. And basically, we're going to completely transform the firm from being in the oil sector to being in the renewable sector. This is a massive transformation. I would say even unseen in that sector so far and still unparalleled in the sector, which actually IMD was fortunate to work very closely with Nest in that time. And I think the interesting quote from that is what I really like is from their CEO of the time, who said, the problem is if you are ahead of your time, you're basically wrong for, let's say, if you're ahead of time 10 years, you're basically wrong for 9 years and right for 1 year, because you basically need to push against the entire current economic system for 9 years to prove them that this actually has value. And I think this is the biggest challenge that we have, and Knut touched upon is, it's that we need to reconcile different time horizons. These business models, these innovative solutions that, and by the way, technology is often there, the business model, so that it really pays off, that it can actually be superior to what we have today, will only be in the future. And now we have to bridge this, what I say, Horizon 1, Horizon 3. In Horizon 3, this business model, the sustainable business model, will be the superior one, will be the one that also cashes out more money, all of this. In Horizon 1, though, you still have a business model that you need to, at one point, exnovate, take off the market, for this new business model to come in. And I think this is the challenge. What is the right time horizon is very difficult. And this differs across different industries. And then some industries push ahead. If you think about how Tesla, and I know nowadays we don't want to talk about it so much anymore, but Tesla pushed the automotive industry quite in a direction where the automotive industry as a whole said, no, impossible, no business case, we can't go there, electric cars, right? And it basically really pushed. Neste Oil is somewhat trying the same in oil and gas. So I think when big companies then, and back in the days Tesla was small, but if companies really show that it's possible, they can push an entire industry. But for the big energy solution, I think there's not an easy way out. So I know you're hoping for an easy way out, Peter, of how all oil and gas could change overnight. This is for me not an overnight game. This is for me a transition. I often like to talk about revolution, but it requires an evolution to get us there.
Very interesting. And thank you for talking about Tesla. I indeed thought that was the word we could not say anymore. So, but I guess you got it on your bingo card. Well done. I want to get to a few questions from the audience, because people are actually tuning in massively and asking us questions. So let's take one question first from Marta. And Marta is asking us about the role of regulation. Which obviously is not strategy. The role of things like the CSRD and ESRS. And by the way, sub-question, whomever of you is correct in telling me the abbreviation of what these abbreviations stands for, both of these, wins today's book club and gets a gold-plated version of the book. But what is the role of CSRD and ESRS in the process of sustainable business transformation? Knut, first attempt, CSRD, ESRS, what does it stand for? And then you can answer the question.
Yeah, so we are all in the middle of CSRD now, right? It's the European regulation as it relates to disclosure. And most companies, especially first those who are of course of a certain size, are finding this really complicated. And very time intensive and costly. So this is the European regulation. It's coming into force, but it's not just European. It's for any company that actually has business in Europe of a certain size. And it is about how we report our non-financial performance. It's very extensive. There is what they call an omnibus out to test out whether we are going to loosen it up. I don't think we're going to loosen it up, but I think we're going to be more pragmatic. And personally, I'm always optimistic. I think we're going to see a unification globally over time, let's say over a decade. Because in a sense, we only have two systems now. We have what's called the ISSB, so the International Standard of Sustainability, which is adopted by most countries. It's a little bit less stringent in some ways because it doesn't include everything, a little bit less stringent than the European one. But you could imagine us unifying all of it. Because the ISSB actually in some ways is also what's now being adopted by large firms in China. So that would be great. If we could unify, we would have one common platform. And let's be optimistic. 10 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. There were so many standards, so many ways of reporting, so many different ways of doing it. So in my opinion, disclosure is important. And the more we unify it, the better it is. That's different from regulation, right? Because regulation also includes the requirements, but it also can include the incentives. And here, I think we have huge differences. Europe tends to be regulatory driven. US, definitely China, are investment, incentive, and subsidy driven. Very big difference. And here, I think there will be a lot of playing out over the next decade as well, because Europe needs to catch up and build this into industrial policy. For China, this is definitely industry and competitiveness. And for the US, you can say largely the same as well. But it won't be investments under the banner of sustainability. It will be investments into nationally important competitiveness, I would say. So that's, I don't know if that was simple, but that's the way I think about it.
No, I don't think it was simple. I suppose there is no simple answer to this, but I guess we get a second contestant, Julia. And by the way, you can still win the prize because Knut handily avoided saying the full abbreviation of CSRD and ESRS. Do you want to give it a go?
Okay, so CSRD is, I think, the one that is the migraine word of the last year, which is the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive that is now compulsory for every large firm in Europe or doing business with Europe. And then ESRS is the European Sustainable Reporting Standards, which basically gives more of the guidelines of how companies need to report upon them. There's also then more when it comes to investors that need to disclose. So there are a lot of these reporting standards out there now. Let's maybe go back to Marta's question for a second. I think what is the role then of the regulator? And I think the biggest role from my perspective that a regulator has, and that the regulator in none of the countries we're talking about has actually achieved yet, is setting the economic framework conditions right, leveling the playing field. We're still in a world where we externalize social and environmental costs, where economists around the world agree that climate change and other environmental problems are the biggest market failure because we have not in-priced them. And basically, we're still in this framework where basically if you're doing business that goes on cost of environment or society, you can still be better off financially. As long as this is the case, and basically those companies that do align their activities with sustainability are the ones that do that out of, let's say, conviction or because they want to, for personal reasons, then the economic framework is not correct, right? Then we basically have a problem. And I think this is the biggest task for every regulator, is to actually look into that. Now, how we do get there is then in Europe, it's really all around disclosure. And I think, A, it can only be the first step. And B, maybe we have overdone that a little bit. In that sense that I think disclosure is extremely important. We need to understand what we're talking about. We're coming from a world where everybody could claim they're the most sustainable company. I always joked and said, I've never worked with the not most sustainable company. Never, right? So whenever I look at the website, it's the most sustainable company. And I work with competitors, so it's interesting, right? So, but it's always the most sustainable company. So it's good that we're moving away to put a little bit of, let's say, more objective criteria to what is this most sustainable company. I would even go as far to say, let's move away from being the most sustainable company, because there's no such thing as the most sustainable company. If we look at sustainability, and these are environmental and social factors, no company today has all of this achieved. There are some that are really good in waste prevention, there are others that are good in pollution, there are others good in tackling CO2 emissions, then in DEI issue and mental health, right? So let's be much more specific. What is it that is your USSP, your unique sustainability selling proposition, so to say, right? And I think, again, just to bring it now back, is we need, as a regulator, set the framework conditions right. And I think we need to understand that at the moment, what these disclosure requirements have done, at least in the short term, is that we're keeping all our sustainability teams busy with tick the box exercises and collecting data, which will do us a favor in the long term so that we have more transparency. In the short term, and amidst the whole economic downturn in Europe, I think we need to see how can we also use sustainability as a competitive advantage, more like the Chinese model to this.
Very interesting. And by the way, don't think I didn't notice that you snuck in there a new abbreviation, the USSP, the Unique Sustainability Selling Proposition. Julia, nice try, but I caught it. Thank you for adding to the alphabet soup of ESG.
With pleasure.
But I will give her the prize, though.
Julia gets a prize, absolutely. Well done. I want to end it with two questions from the audience. And by the way, people are really interested in the discussion. That you can follow the webinar chat, which is almost as interesting, I would say, as this panel discussion. Thank you for everyone who's contributed to that. With these two final questions, the one is actually from Ben Adewai. I hope I said that correctly. And Ben is asking us about what role do nonprofits and small companies play in this sustainability transformation of the system as a whole, knowing that most cases, I suppose, that you focus on in the book, and that indeed generally people talk about are of major corporations. Let's start with that one question. I'll ask you the final question in a little bit. Knut, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to go get us started. Small companies first, okay? So when I'm pessimistic, and I guess everybody who works in this space, there's a day when you're optimistic, a day when you're pessimistic, because that's the reality we're in. But when I'm down on this, I think about the 200,000 companies, startups, every day working on improving and creating new climate technologies. 200,000 companies. That's a huge number of experiments, the development of new technologies, etc. So I think small companies have a huge role to play here. They develop new technologies, they challenge the big ones. I hope we'll see the Facebooks and the Amazons of sustainability over the next decade or two. They are super important. So that's one player, right? That's the small, but it's maybe now I started talking mostly about the startups. And then two words about the non-governmental, the NGOs. They are important, right? Because they focus our attention. They challenge us, they challenge the companies, etc. That being said, I'm a little bit in a question mark when it comes to the role of NGOs going forward, because I don't think it's so much about the kind of awareness and activism to create awareness. I think we're much more into the how do we find solutions, how do we work together to improve, etc. And I don't see that the NGOs are as strong there as they have been at kind of grabbing our attention. So that is a little bit of a challenge, I would say, to the NGOs. Of course, they're there, they create alliances and they create attention, etc. But I think there's a job to be done in defining how can NGOs really help us drive towards bigger solutions. It's a question in my mind.
I think I understand why you still work for a business school, Knut, given your skepticism about nonprofit organizations.
But we're in a new phase now,
But that's okay. And I will say one more thing. I'm an astute observer and listener. You talked about Facebook. Earlier on, you corrected me on Statoil and saying it was Equinor after.
Yeah, Meta. Good one.
Facebook
Okay.
Is now Meta. Well, Julia, over to you. I want to ask you a more specific question, also coming in from Milan and Nisha. If we now take this earlier question about what role do companies play, smaller companies play, Mila and Nisha are asking about, the monetization. If we really focus on that element of it, the return on investment. A lot of the questions in the web chat are about that. Like if you look at the business case, return on investment, the monetization, what would you say are some good strategies to get to that ROI on sustainability?
Yeah. Let me start from the startups and then take it to the later question that's more specific. I did my PhD on sustainable startups because I was so convinced that they will bring us towards a more sustainable future. And I was convinced for about 8 to 10 years. I was pushing the agenda only around entrepreneurship and startups. Why? Because so much is happening in that space, right? So sustainable entrepreneurs are the ones that are really pushing the boundaries. They provide solutions that multinationals don't even want to touch, or we don't know that they're working on it, right? So where multinationals often profit a lot from the status quo and their incentive to kind of really look for radical innovation is rather low, you see that sustainable startups show to the world, to the consumer, to stakeholders that it's possible, right? Where we talked about Tesla and electric car, where all the automotive players told us, no, it's not possible to have a sports car that is also electric. Tesla proved them wrong. And then it's basically, that is a little bit the role of startups, I feel, is to basically push multinationals out of their comfort zone. Now they have their own challenge because, and this is why I think at one point I also like to switch and work with multinationals, is how do we get now the sustainable startups out of their niche so that it's not just a few green consumers and that it's really not impacting change on a larger scale. I think this is where, how do we then work with startups and multinationals becomes a very interesting kind of playing field. That with respect to the startups. Now, the monetization of sustainability is one of the biggest ongoing debates. And I think for me, and now in an act of shameless self-promotion, I love circularity. And I think circularity is really where I feel we need to go. This is where the other book, The Circular Business Revolution.
I was going to say, you're self-promoting because your previous book was on circularity.
Exactly. But this is where I think we have this for the first time, because what we struggle right now is whenever we have economic growth, we also have environmental impact. And this is true on an individual level. The higher your income, the higher your environmental footprint. On a company level, the more growth, the higher your environmental footprint as a company. On a national level, the higher GDP, the higher the environmental footprint. So this is at the moment the biggest problem we have. Whenever there's economic growth, there's environmental impact. Now, the circular economy basically allows us to kind of, at least in theory, we see practical examples, but we still need to scale it, is this idea, how can I achieve economic growth while basically disentangling that from resource extraction. And I think this is where then the monetization or the return on investment comes in. And maybe we need to liberate ourselves just from profits and money, because the economic benefit could be de-risking supply chains. And you mentioned geopolitical conflicts in the start of this conversation. This is one. But think about resource shortages. Think about increasing resource prices. Think about cocoa, which went through the roof last year. So if you are in chocolate industry, prices went up tremendously for this one single resource you really need. So we need to think about resources very differently, from abundance, where we are coming from, to shortage. And then the business case becomes much more tangible, because then it's about circularity. How do I monetize waste, for instance, right? How do I keep my resources much more in cycles? And suddenly the business case might not be profit, right? There are direct benefits, of course. Hopefully we increase profits, but there are also indirect benefits, de-risking supply chains, making the company more resilient, differentiating your products, diversification. So the benefits can then be manifold. And I think maybe we need to broaden our conversation then about this business case, because I think we have been narrowly focusing on more returns. Let's broaden that. And I think, Peter, this is what you're also calling for. How do we think about capital differently, right? It's maybe not just economic capital that counts. And how do we really value different types of capital as well?
I'm glad that you're now not just doing self-promotion, but also pitching my book, Julia. Thank you so much. It's called The New Nature of Business. And we will talk about it next Monday in Davos. So yes, in a way, it is self-promotion, because Julia will be on the panel talking about that book as well. A final question for both of you, though, as we close, which is, if you had to take, if you wanted people to take one lesson away from your book and from this session, what would it be? And you both get a question. Since this is the final round, the clock ticks down from 60 seconds to 0. Knut?
No, I think my big message, I mentioned it, it's the kind of the head, heart, and the hands, right? It's this is not just an intellectual exercise. This is people engaging, companies building competitive advantage, etc. But I just want to add one thing, okay? I said we're in the time when we have to make money on sustainability. And that seems difficult, but it isn't, of course, because there's so much data showing it. So I'll just give the simplest of examples. McKinsey shows very convincingly that up until now, if we look at CapEx, 70% is high emission. From now on, 70% is low emission. That is a mega opportunity for those who are able to bring the solutions of tomorrow to table. Or another one, the biggest source of innovation today is climate and sustainability. In other words, we're talking about something which actually will drive the big innovations of the future. So from my perspective, you know, we are executives, we're managers, we're leaders. Our job is to seize that opportunity. That's maybe my main message, Peter.
It's amazing. I heard you loud and clear, although I have to say, as a skeptical journalist, my takeaway from your last takeaway is that there's still people out there who cite McKinsey as the most credible source for things, which is interesting given the news cycle about McKinsey. Julia, what's your main takeaway?
Look, I think my main message is across what we've discussed, let's continue to push the boundaries. I think it's so easy when we look to the US, whether it's the LA fires, whether it's the Trump administration, I think it's easy to say, now is the time to not focus on that. Gen AI is also a hot topic, right? So let's focus our attention on one thing that might be more tangible in the short term. I think it's a long-term problem but we start seeing it today, and we need to start transforming the firm today. And I think what I hope that you're taking away from this is that it actually is not just a risk, it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for differentiation. It's an opportunity to position your company today for a much more resilient business future, that there is a massive alignment with business, and that sustainability should be approached much more strategically and less just from a moral responsibility, which it clearly is. But I think there's a massive strategic rationale side of it. And I think this is a massive important message that if you go and present this topic, don't go there. It's the right thing to do to save the planet. It's actually also the right thing to do for the business and to make the business more resilient.
I think that's an excellent takeaway. I thank you both, Julia and Knut, for this amazing session. And I thank all of you for having joined us and stayed with us for these past 50 minutes. I want to remind you, though, although you have made it through this lunch session, you still have to get through the book. The book is available now, wherever books are sold, I suppose. Leading the Sustainable Business Transformation. You've had the preview from us with Julia and Knut, the editors. Knut, you're just the editors, you said. There's many more contributors, many more case studies to be looked at, and an amazing forward also from your president and chairman, I noticed, at IMD. So go get that book. Thank you for joining us for this lunch session. Thank you for all of you to participate also in the web chat. I found that very interesting as well. And hope to see you soon, perhaps next week in Davos, or indeed at the next IMD Book Club chat. Thank you, and see you soon.
And thank you very much
to you, Peter.
Thank you.
You.